You alright folks, and welcome back. Gear will be a bit different for a lot of classes in Cataclysm. I've touched on it briefly before, mainly with regards to how Dungeon Lit will work and the odd mention of stats here and there. So today I thought I'd go over a few of the more important updates where stats and your gear are concerned. Now, I'm not going to go over every single class and every single spec and every single teeny tiny little change. We'll be here all day. This is about the big foundational important things and basically how they'll interact with your classes, and a lot of those can just be clumped together. This isn't about those stats that you spend hours wringing your wrists over as you watch your sims spit out something that can allow you to squeeze an extra 10 DPS from your rotation. Though if there is something particularly noteworthy outside of the big things, I will mention it. And before we crack on, the specialization passive, which is a thing in Kata, is a big thing. So you will get a primary stat bonus if all your items are, say, plate, if you're a warrior. Mixing and matching is somewhat frowned upon in this version of the game, and technically you will get penalised for it. I just wanted to mention that here in case, at the end of this, someone wants to ask the clever question, what if I use some leather items on my paladin and they've got agility? Simple answer, you shouldn't be doing that. Anyway, let's start with the tanks, with the exception of ferals for now. Defense, it is no more. So reaching defense cap is not really a thing in Cataclysm, at least as we know it now. Instead of using bits of gear, gems and enchants to reach the defense cap, which is a requirement for endgame tanking at the moment, lest you get curb stomped into strawberry jam the moment the boss gets annoyed with you for insulting its sainted mother. In Cataclysm, tanks will instead need to rely on their talents and abilities a bit more to achieve critical hit immunities, improved blood presence for DKs, or sanctuary for prop paladins, for example. It's worth noting that any talent that decreases your chance to be crit, like the aforementioned, caps out at 6%. Essentially, this puts more emphasis on other stats like dodge and block rating, your stamina, etc., and any pre-existing items that currently have defense on them as a stat will have that converted into one of the other dedicated tanking stats instead, and of course anything from Kata will be designed with this alteration in mind. We then move on to the melee, and the hunters and bears. So these are your attack power specs in the previous versions of Classic. In Cataclysm, attack power, like defense, is gone. Well, not so much gone, just provided by other things, so you won't be seeing items with 300 attack power, for example. Depending on your class, you'll either get your attack power from strength or agility, so your primary stat is going to be far more impactful this expansion, and you won't be having debates over things like an item having a chunk of attack power, or another with the rough equivalent in agility or strength. You just get the primary stat, and that's that. But a quick caveat on that, agility classes, if they were to hover over strength in their stat window, would see that it increases your attack power. So you might reckon it's worth using a strength item or a gem or what have you now that attack power as a standalone stat is no more. It isn't. Agility will provide the attack power you need, and some crit as a bonus. Same with strength users, agility just isn't as useful for you as it once was. But in Cataclysm, there should be no reason an item has 2 primary stats on it. In Classic up to now, it would not be uncommon to get items that had both strength and agility on, for example. Granted, this was far less common in Wrath, where it was pretty standard for items used by AP classes to only have one or the other, but in TBC and Vanilla, it was a fairly common sight to have both. For strength users, agility will, like it has done up to this point, say something along the lines of increases crit chance. Again, it's not really going to be worth targeting over a strength item with some critical strike on it as a secondary stat, or just reforging an item to meet your needs. So, the bears, I excluded them from the tanking section earlier because, well, they're the odd one out. Every other tanking class prior to Kata are plate wearers and require defense as a stat, and because of that teeny tiny little fact, a lot of plate gear is actually designed with tanks in mind with the appropriate stats, as any and all of those classes can use the items in theory, and they were heavily reliant on said items to reach their defense caps. Ferals instead had the talent Survival of the Fittest to reach their crit immunities, something that, as I mentioned earlier, is in fact being rolled out to all other tanking specs in Cata with the removal of defense as a specific stat. So that change doesn't actually have any bearing on this spec at all. Which means as far as gear goes, it's pretty much the same story as it's been for bears up to this point, using the same sort of items as their cat counterparts, just with tanky gems and enchants. There just really wouldn't be anyone else in the game who could make genuine use of bespoke leather tanking gear were it to be implemented. It would be a complete waste of time and resources. This isn't Season of Discovery. Don't be expecting rogues to rock up and main tank a full Firelands run. We're respectable here, we do things properly, the old-fashioned way. And obviously, for legal and not wanting to be murdered reasons, that was a joke. Because of this then, stats like Mastery, for example, update depending on the form in use. So two ferals wearing the exact same items will actually get very different benefits from that gear at a baseline, depending on whether they go bear or cat. Obviously, again, gems, talents, etc. will dictate how effective those stats ultimately are, but it does actually mean that ferals are the last bastion of emergency backup tank if something were to go very wrong in a fight in Cataclysm, because other classes don't get such dynamic on-the-fly updates to their stats for merely changing a form or stance. A DPS DK's crit in haste isn't going to immediately convert to dodge and parry if they were to go blood presence, for example. So to finish this section then, I'll just say that any bits of gear that have attack power on at the end of Wrath will have that stat converted to agility, and Armor Pen is also going to be retired and instead converted into either crit or haste, depending on the item. Now let's take a gander at casters. Spell power is going the way of attack power, mostly, because whilst intellect will be providing spell power, the same as agility and strength will provide attack power, spell power stubbornly clings onto weapons, so you will get a hell of a lot of it from your stabbing sticks in this expansion. The idea being to clearly define caster weapons and differentiate them from tanking and melee weapons. But intellect provides more than just simple spell power. It increases your mana pool and, like agility, increases the critical strike rating of the classes for which it is a primary stat. As such, intellect will certainly be far more important than it has been, simply because without it, you're gonna hit like a dandelion in a gentle summer's breeze and have no mana pool to speak of. Now, let's look at a few specific changes a moment because they are important. So firstly, Mages and Warlocks. In Wrath, these two classes are actually fairly reliant on Spirit for a myriad of reasons, be it converting to pure spell power or contributing to other stats like crit. Basically, that's no longer the case in Cata, as a lot of what that stat does for them will be covered by intellect and other secondary stats like Mastery. However, that is not the case for every caster. Boomkins, Shadows, and Elementals will actually have a use for Spirit in Cata, which in the case of the Shaman is really bloody odd. It's not so peculiar that a Boomkin or Shadow Priest might have the odd Spirit item here and there in Wrath. It's a stat that interacts with their healing counterparts and actually them to some degree, so a few of those items might overlap. But if you were to go to a raid dressed in Spirit gear as an Elemental, you'd be laughed at, and rightly so. It's basically a dead stat for Shamans up to Cata. But in Cataclysm, Spirit undergoes a slight change, as it is now the replacement for MP5. Spirit will just increase your mana regen, and the more of it you have, the more mana you'll get back. It's pretty simple. Because of this, there will be a lot more gear catered towards the Shaman with Spirit on. As such, it has now been made useful to both Elemental and Resto, in the same way it is useful to Druids and Priests of the relevant flavours. So how is the healer stat supposed to be useful to a pure-blooded murder machine? Well, the three specs I mentioned, Balance, Elemental, and Shadow, all have talents early on in their trees that, once maxed out, convert 100% of the Spirit on your gear to hit. So Spirit means hit chance in Cataclysm, which at first sight might seem a little bit odd. But as far as Elemental and Balance go at least, it's because they just share gear with their healing counterparts. And as such, that gear won't have hit chance on it, because both versions of Resto don't need it. Shadow Priests, however, are sort of in this weird middle ground, because whilst they can share gear with their healing compadres, it doesn't mean they have to, because cloth gear that's being used by warlocks and mages will just have pure hit on it as a stat, so they're probably going to be doing a bit of mixing and matching. Having said that though, boomkins and elementals will still be able to use rings and necks and cloaks and so on that have hit on it and not spirit. It'll just be down to what individual item is better for you at the time. In terms of the gear you use, it'll be the same as all other specs. Clothies will stick to cloth, druids to leather, and shaman to mail. It's why this spirit change is implemented, because you're already going to be restricted to your armor type, technically anyway, and this will allow for multiple viable options within that bracket without creating an insane amount of items with similar stats to compensate for the differences of DPS and healers. So, speaking of healers, let's go over them quickly. As I said, Spirit is now the healer stat, and every flavour of healer will want it on their gear in some form. If, like I said, you've been playing a Shaman up to this point, or need a Paladin, Spirit is not really a stat that you would have wanted. In fact, the sight of it on an item would probably have made you run in the opposite direction very quickly in most cases. Again, it was just a dead stat for them. Priests and druids were designed in such a way that their classes interacted with spirit in a meaningful manner, and it helped them keep their mana topped up, whereas shaman and paladins had other bells and whistles in their toolkit to keep them going. With mana per 5 being taken out back and unceremoniously shot, Spirit is now the regeneration stat, plain and simple. It's not to say it is the all-round best stat for every healer. I don't want someone coming away from this with the impression that if they fully enchant, gem and reforge their budding holy paladin with spirits, they will become some unstoppable healing force. Probably not, just that the sight of spirit on an item is not to be feared and is just the replacement mana regen stat from here on in. Other than that, there's not really much in the way of changes for healers where the stats on their gear is concerned. Obviously, they'll also be affected by the spell power changes I mentioned for casters because they too like spell power, so intellect will be something they want in spades, and different specs will want different secondary stats, but that's not really any different to now. But given that Spirit and MP5 had previously run side by side, it's just worth noting that Spirit is just the all-rounder for all flavours of healer now, not just the priests and the druids. Before I finish, there's one specific thing I'd like to mention here because it just doesn't really fit anywhere in anything else that I'm doing right now, and that is relics. So in Cataclysm, they are going to be a single thing. Up to this point, they have been sub-categorized into 4 distinct items that are covered under the umbrella term of relic. You've got totems for shaman, sigils for DK, idols for druids, and librams for paladins. These are the things you stick in the range slot for those classes, and they provide a smattering of buffs and what have you during play, usually with a bunch of different ones per spec that activate based on what spells you're using. In Kata, they are merged into a single entity, and any that drop or that you can purchase in Kata are in theory equipable by all of the classes I've just mentioned. As such, they no longer provide benefits or alterations to gameplay based on class or even spec. They are just simply stat sticks, often with a solid chunk of primary stat with some secondaries which will dictate what class/spec it's decent for. There might be the odd one or two that stands out, but due to the fact a Resto Shaman could technically pick up and use a relic with dodge, strength, and parry on, they aren't exactly designed to be anything more than an equivalent to wands and ranged weapons, which is a shame. They may not have been the most impressive bit of kit up to now, but again, I'm always in favour of flavour, and this is distinctly lacking in seasoning, shall we say. Anyway, that's me for now. It's probably not actually been that big, but it felt huge to record this one, so I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your own thoughts down below. Be so kind, like, sub, share your pals, and so on. That'd be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.